The town of Harbor Bend, Maine, smelled like salt and wood smoke in October, and Elias Navarro had learned to love that smell the way other men loved perfume on a lover's neck. It meant the season was turning. It meant the tourists were thinning out, and the town was folding back into itself, becoming small and quiet and his again. He stood in the doorway of Nana Rosa's at 6 in the morning, watching the fishing boats cut through the fog on the water below, their running lights blinking like slow heartbeats. Behind him, the trattoria was dark except for the low glow over the pass, where he'd left one light burning all night, the way his mother used to. Old habit, old grief dressed up as ritual. 3 years since she'd died, and Elias still set 2 coffee cups out some mornings before he caught himself. He was 32 years old, built like a man who worked with his hands. Broad through the shoulders, forearms scarred from a decade of hot pans and dull knives he refused to replace because they'd been his mother's. He wore his dark hair a little too long because he hadn't had time for a haircut in a month, and there was a permanent crease between his eyebrows that his younger sister, Marisol, liked to tease him about. "You'll scowl yourself into an old man before 40, Eli." Maybe, but someone had to keep the lights on. Someone had to keep Nana Rosa's exactly as it had always been. The same red-checked tablecloths, the same handwritten menu, the same slow-simmered Sunday gravy, because if he changed anything, even one thing, it would feel like erasing her. Across the street, in the building that used to be Harbor Bend Hardware before it went under and sat empty for 2 years, the lights were already on in ember. Elias didn't need to look to know Sawyer Reyes was in there. He could practically feel it, the way you feel weather coming before you see the clouds. An electric hum in the air that had nothing to do with the man himself and everything to do with what he represented. Change, disruption, the kind of restaurant that got written up in glossy magazines with words like deconstructed and elevated and reimagined, words that made Elias's jaw tighten because underneath them was an unspoken accusation. That what he did, what his mother had done and her mother before her, was somehow less old-fashioned, a relic. He turned back inside, into the familiar dim of the dining room before opening. 31 tables, red-checked cloths worn soft with age. The faint smell of garlic and wood smoke that had soaked so deep into the walls it would probably outlast the building itself. A wall of photographs ran along the back, decades of Navarro faces, weddings and christenings and Sunday dinners, his grandmother's stern, proud gaze presiding over all of it from the center frame like a saint watching her congregation. Elias touched 2 fingers to the frame's edge on his way past. The way he did every morning, a small unconscious ritual that had outlived any memory of when it started. By 6:30, Marisol would arrive with the morning's bread order, and by 11, the lunch prep would begin in earnest, and somewhere in between, Elias would find himself, as he always did, glancing across the street more than any well-adjusted man had business doing. Ember had opened 4 months ago. In 4 months, Sawyer Reyes had taken half of Elias's regulars, a write-up in Down East magazine, and, infuriatingly, the good favor of half the town council, who liked having something shiny to point to when they talked about Harbor Bend's revitalization. Elias hated him. That was the simple version. The version he told himself while chopping onions harder than necessary, while slamming pot lids, while glaring across the street like a man in a western squaring off before a duel. The truth was more complicated, and Elias was not yet ready to look directly at it. Sawyer Reyes had not meant to become anyone's rival. He had meant, for months ago, to disappear. He was 30 years old and had spent the last 6 of them in New York City kitchens that ran on adrenaline and fear, kitchens where he'd clawed his way from line cook to sous chef to, finally, executive chef of a restaurant that earned a star and then, 18 months later, nearly killed him. Not literally, but close enough that the paramedics who'd found him passed out on the walk-in floor at 2 a.m., dehydrated and hollowed out from 3 days without real sleep, had used the word collapse in a tone that made his mother cry over the phone from California. He remembered the hospital more than he liked to admit. The fluorescent lights, the heart monitor, and the empty chair beside his bed where his boyfriend of 2 years should have been and wasn't, because 2 days into Sawyer's recovery, Theo had told him, gently, apologetically, that he hadn't signed up to watch someone destroy himself and left. Sawyer didn't blame him, not really. He understood the impulse to run from something breaking. He'd spent his whole life running toward the next accolade, the next review, the next proof that he was worth keeping around, and somewhere in that sprint he'd forgotten how to simply stay. So when he found Harbor Bend by accident, driving up the coast with no destination in mind, and saw the for lease sign on the old hardware store with the harbor glinting behind it, something in his chest had gone quiet for the first time in years. He told himself Ember would be different, smaller, slower, a place where he cooked because he loved it, not because he was terrified of what he'd be without it. He had not counted on the trattoria across the street, or its owner, who looked at Sawyer like he'd personally set fire to the town's soul. Sawyer had grown up the way a lot of ambitious, restless kids do, moving often, his mother working 2 jobs after his father left when Sawyer was 6, learning early that the surest way to be noticed, to be kept, was to be exceptional at something. Cooking had found him almost by accident at 14, in a high school culinary elective he'd only taken because the schedule worked out, and it had felt immediately like the first language he'd ever been fluent in. By 19 he was working stages in real kitchens. By 24 he'd made sous chef. By 28 executive chef, a star, a write-up in a magazine his mother kept laminated on her refrigerator door. He had also, somewhere in that decade of relentless climbing, forgotten how to sit still. Forgotten if he'd ever really known how to let a place or a person matter to him without immediately calculating what it would cost him to lose it. Theo had told him once, in the good years before the bad ones, that Sawyer loved his kitchen the way other people loved a person, entirely, recklessly, without any instinct for self-preservation, and that someday it was going to be the end of him. Theo had been more right than either of them wanted to admit. Harbor Bend, in that light, was less an escape than an experiment. Could Sawyer Reyes build something without destroying himself to do it? For months in, he still didn't fully know the answer. But something about the quiet, the cold mornings, the particular gray-gold light off the harbor at dawn, had begun to feel less like a consolation prize and more like an actual life, right up until the man across the street started occupying more of his thoughts than any menu ever had. Sawyer had tried, in the beginning, to be neighborly. He'd walked over with a bottle of wine his first week, some instinct toward peace offerings left over from a childhood of moving to new towns and needing to make friends fast. Elias Navarro had opened the door, taken one look at the label and said, "We don't drink imports here," before shutting it. Not unkindly exactly, but with a finality that told Sawyer everything he needed to know about where he stood. After that, Sawyer stopped trying to be liked by the broad-shouldered, scowling man across the street, and started, instead, noticing him. The way he stood in his doorway every morning like a lighthouse keeper surveying the water. The way he moved through his kitchen. Sawyer could see it through the front windows some nights, with a kind of tired, devoted grace, like a man tending something sacred. It was easier to resent someone. Sawyer knew that. Resentment asked nothing of you. But some stubborn, curious part of him kept watching Elias Navarro anyway. The way you watch a storm on the horizon, unable to look away even though you know somehow it's headed straight for you. Harbor Bend had exactly one main street, for 1,000 year-round residents, and a harbor deep enough for lobster boats but too shallow for anything grander, which was precisely why the tourists who did come stayed for a weekend and not a season. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone's business, where the bell above a shop door was as good as an announcement to half the block, and where a new restaurant opening across from an institution like Nana Rose's was, by definition, an event. Nana Rose's had been open for 31 years. Elias's grandmother, Rosa Navarro, had emigrated from a small town outside Palermo in her 20s, married a Maine lobsterman, and opened the trattoria in a building that had once been a dry goods store, filling it with the recipes she'd carried across an ocean in the only luggage that mattered: memory. When Rosa passed, Elias's mother, Carmen, took over, softening some of the harder edges of the old menu, adding her own touches, but keeping the bones of the place sacred. And when Carmen died 3 years ago, it had simply, inevitably fallen to Elias the way the tide falls to the shore, not a choice so much as a fact of geography. He had never resented the responsibility, not really. What he resented, if he was honest with the parts of himself he rarely examined, was the fear underneath it, the fear that he was not simply keeping a business alive, but standing guard over the last tangible pieces of his mother and grandmother left in the world, and that any deviation, any risk, any change, might somehow let them slip further away. Ember's building had a less sentimental history. Harbor Bend Hardware, run for 40 years by a man named Gus Pelletier who'd finally retired to Florida and left the space to rot. Its windows soaped over, its old Harbor Bend hardware sign fading letter by letter until only HAR or BND remained. A joke the town told for 2 years running. When word went around that someone had leased it, some outsider, some city chef nobody had heard of, half the town had been skeptical, the other half simply curious. Sawyer had gutted the interior himself in the first month, tearing out rotted shelving, refinishing the original tin ceiling he'd found underneath decades of drop panels, salvaging what he could and building the rest from reclaimed wood he'd sourced from a barn 2 towns over. He'd wanted Ember to feel like it had always belonged there, not like an invader, though it would take him months to understand that no amount of careful renovation could fast-track belonging in a town like Harbor Bend, where trust was earned in years and small gestures, not in a single opening night, however impressive the reviews. The 2 restaurants sat on opposite sides of Harbor Street like 2 different philosophies of survival, one built on preservation, the other on reinvention, and for 4 months, that was exactly how both men understood each other. Preservation versus reinvention. Tradition versus ambition. It would take a great deal more than a shared propane tank to teach either of them how much those 2 philosophies actually had in common. Both were, in their own way, simply trying to build something that couldn't be taken away again. The rivalry became public spectacle at the Harbor Bend Harvest Festival in late October, when the town council, in what Elias considered a personal betrayal, invited both restaurants to run competing food stalls at the harborfront. The festival itself was Harbor Bend's proudest annual tradition, a day when the whole harborfront transformed into a maze of striped tents and hay bales, pumpkins stacked in careful pyramids outside the general store. The smell of cider donuts and would smoke thick in the cold October air. Fishermen's kids ran between the stalls in flannel and rubber boots. The church choir sang from the gazebo steps, and by early afternoon the whole town had gathered along the water in a scene that could have come straight off a postcard, the kind of small-town Americana that made the tourist board's promotional photos look almost restrained by comparison. "It's good publicity," Marisol told him, arms crossed, refusing to let him say no. She was 26, ran the front of house at Nana Rose's, and had exactly 0 patience for her brother's stubbornness. "You show up, you make your gravy. People remember why they've loved us for 30 years. That's it. You don't even have to look at him." Elias looked at him anyway. Constantly. Sawyer's stall was 20 feet away, all clean white signage and a chalkboard menu written in looping cursive: seared scallop crostini, brown butter squash soup, cider braised short rib, and a line that, infuriatingly, wrapped around the gazebo by noon. Elias's line was shorter but steadier, full of familiar faces, people who'd been coming to Nana Rose's since before Elias could walk. He told himself that was worth more. He told himself a lot of things that day, standing over his portable burner in the cold October wind, stirring gravy that had simmered since for that morning, watching Sawyer Reyes laugh with a customer, throw his head back, dimples deep in his cheeks, sleeves rolled up over forearms dusted with flour. It was deeply unfair, Elias thought, that a man could be so irritating and so beautiful at the same time. It felt like a design flaw in the universe. Twice that morning, Sawyer had wandered past Elias's stall under the thin pretense of checking the festival map posted nearby, and both times he'd made some pointed, needling comment. "Smells like 1992 over here," delivered with a grin that took most of the sting out of it, and both times Elias had fired back something equally sharp, something about pretentious foam and portions too small to feed a bird, and both times, infuriatingly, he'd found himself fighting down a smile. After Sawyer walked away, it was, he thought, an entirely new and unwelcome sensation, enjoying an argument. By noon, the town had clearly picked sides without meaning to, forming 2 loose, overlapping lines that occasionally merged in the middle, people balancing paper cups of Sawyer's squash soup in one hand and bowls of Elias's gravy in the other, refusing, with the particular loyalty of small-town life, to declare an actual winner. Mrs. Okafor from the church choir loudly informed both men, mouth full, that she'd had both and wasn't telling, and swept off toward the cider stand looking entirely too pleased with herself. Around 2 in the afternoon, disaster struck in the small, mundane way disasters usually do. Elias's burner sputtered, coughed, and died, the propane line frozen solid from the cold snap that had rolled in that morning. He crouched over it, cursing under his breath, aware of the line of customers watching him with the particular impatience of people who'd been promised gravy and bread. Propane freezes below 20 degrees if the tank's low, said a voice above him. You need to swap it or warm the line. Elias looked up. Sawyer stood there, hands in the pockets of his chef's coat, not gloating, which surprised Elias more than anything. Just watching with an assessing, practical expression. I know how propane works, Elias said, more sharply than he meant to. Sure. Sawyer crouched down beside him anyway, close enough that Elias could smell rosemary and citrus and something warmer underneath. Skin and sweat from a full day of cooking. I've got a spare tank at my stall. Full one. You can have it. Why? The question came out suspicious, almost accusatory. Sawyer's mouth curved. Not quite a smile. Because it's a small town, and if Nana Roses runs out of gravy at the Harvest Festival, they'll blame me for hexing you, and honestly, I don't need that headline in the Harbor Bend Gazette. Despite himself, Elias let out something that was almost a laugh. A short, surprised huff of air. It had been a long time since anyone had made him do that without meaning to. They swapped the tank in silence, Sawyer's hands quick and sure with the fittings. And when the burner caught flame again, blue and steady, Sawyer stood, brushed off his knees and said, There. Try not to burn the place down with it. I've been cooking longer than you've been alive, Elias said, which wasn't even true. There were only 2 years between them, but it came out anyway, some old defensive reflex. Sawyer's eyebrows lifted, amused. Noted, old man. And then he walked back to his own stall, and Elias stood there for a long moment, gravy spoon in hand, feeling strangely unsteady, like the ground had tilted a few degrees without his permission. That night, he found a full, unopened propane tank sitting outside the trattoria's back door. No note, no reason for it, just quietly left there like an apology that didn't want credit. Elias stared at it for a long time before bringing it inside. November settled over Harbor Bend like a held breath. The tourists were gone entirely now, the harbor grown quiet except for the working boats, and the town seemed to exhale into its true, smaller self. The self Elias had always loved best, though he'd never quite admitted that loving a slow season could sit right alongside the anxiety of a slow season, of thinner crowds and thinner receipts. He noticed, in that hush, how often his eyes went to Ember's windows without his permission. It happened first on a Wednesday, closing time, when a burst pipe in the trattoria's basement sent Elias out into the cold at 11 at night, cursing, flashlight in hand, trying to find the shut-off valve in the dark before the water reached his mother's old recipe boxes stored on a low shelf. He was on his knees in 6 inches of freezing water, swearing colorfully in a mix of English and the Italian his grandmother had taught him, when a shadow fell across the basement stairs. You want a hand? Sawyer said. Or should I just stand here and enjoy the show? How did you even? Saw your lights on through the flooding. Figured it wasn't a party. Sawyer was already rolling up his sleeves, stepping down into the water without hesitation. The cuffs of his jeans instantly soaked. Where's the shutoff? They found it together, Sawyer holding the flashlight steady while Elias wrenched the corroded valve with both hands. And when the water finally slowed to a trickle, they stood in the ruined basement, breathing hard, soaked to the knees, and started laughing. The kind of laughter that comes from adrenaline and cold and the sheer absurdity of 2 grown men standing ankle-deep in a flooded basement at midnight. I owe you, Elias said, wiping his hands on his ruined jeans. You owe me a dry pair of socks is what you owe me. Sawyer's teeth chattered slightly, and something about the sight of him, soaked, shivering, grinning anyway, made Elias's chest do something complicated and warm. He brought Sawyer upstairs into the empty trattoria, found him a pair of Marisol's spare socks from the coat closet, and made them both coffee at 11:40 at night, the 2 of them sitting at a corner table under the dim glow of the past light, steam rising off their mugs, rain still ticking faintly against the windows outside. They didn't talk about the rivalry that night. They talked about small things, Sawyer's mother in California, who called every Sunday and asked when he was coming home, not understanding yet that Harbor Bend had already become home. Elias's father, gone 21 years now, lost in a squall 3 miles off the coast, a story Elias hadn't told anyone outside his own family in longer than he could remember. He told it anyway, quietly, watching Sawyer listen without flinching, without offering easy reassurances, just listening, present, his hand at one point coming to rest, briefly, over Elias's on the table. It was such a small touch. Elias thought about it for days afterward, the specific warmth of it, the calluses on Sawyer's palm from years of knife work, the way neither of them had commented on it or pulled away too quickly. It became, in his memory, the first time he let himself imagine, just briefly, just in the privacy of his own mind, what it might feel like to have that hand there permanently. Comfortable silence followed them after that night. Not the tense, competitive silence of the early months, but something easier, the silence of two people who'd stopped performing for each other, who could sit together over coffee at midnight and simply exist in the same space without needing to fill it. After the festival, something shifted, almost imperceptibly, like a change in barometric pressure before a storm nobody's forecasted yet. Elias still glared across the street some mornings. Sawyer still made pointed remarks about authentic tradition whenever Elias's stubbornness about updating the Trattoria's decor came up at town council meetings. The rivalry didn't die, but it grew a second layer underneath it, something quieter and warmer that neither man named out loud. It showed up in small things. Sawyer started ordering his olive oil from the same importer Elias used, and when Elias found out, Marisol let it slip, gleeful with gossip. He told himself it was theft, imitation, another attempt to steal what made Nana Rosa's special. But some nights, watching Sawyer's kitchen lights through the window, he wondered if it was something else. A kind of respect Sawyer didn't know how to say directly, so he said it with olive oil instead. Elias, for his part, started saving Sawyer a portion of Sunday gravy every week, leaving it in a covered container on the back step of Ember before the dinner rush, never staying to see it collected, never admitting to himself why he did it until he caught himself smiling one Sunday when he found the empty container washed and returned to his own step, with a small sticky note on the lid, better than the wine. SR. He kept that note in the drawer under the register for 3 weeks before he threw it away, embarrassed by how many times he'd reread it. They started running into each other at the fish market on Tuesdays, both there at the same early hour to get first pick of the day's catch. What began as clipped, competitive nods evolved, slowly into conversation about scallop season, about a supplier who was overcharging both of them, about the particular ache of a Maine winter when the tourists left and the town went gray and quiet. "Doesn't it get lonely?" Sawyer asked one gray Tuesday morning, breath fogging in the cold. "Running that place by yourself? No offense, but I never see anyone in there who isn't already 65. "It's not lonely," Elias said, too fast, too defensive, and Sawyer's eyes, dark, perceptive, unfairly kind, lingered on him a beat too long, like he'd heard the lie underneath the words. "Okay," Sawyer said simply and didn't push. Somehow that was worse than if he had. Elias thought about that exchange for days. He thought about how long it had been since he'd let anyone ask him a real question, let alone answer one honestly. He thought about the 2 coffee cups he still sometimes set out by accident. He thought, against every instinct of self-preservation he possessed, about the warm curve of Sawyer's mouth when he almost smiled, and hated himself a little for thinking about it at all. By November, they developed an unlikely rhythm. Not quite friendship, not quite anything either man was willing to name, but something that lived in the space between 2 restaurants that faced each other across a narrow street, connected by string lights the town had hung for the season and a silence that had started to feel less like war and more like waiting. It was Marisol who finally said it out loud, on a slow Thursday night in mid-November, wiping down the bar while Elias scrubbed the same pot for the 3rd time, distracted, glancing at the window more than he wanted to admit. "You like him," she said without preamble. Elias didn't even pretend to misunderstand. "I don't, Eli." She set down her rag. "You leave him gravy. You know his schedule better than you know mine. You got that look on your face right now that you get when you're trying not to have a look on your face. It's not like that. Then what's it like?" He didn't have an answer. That was the truth of it. He didn't know what it was like, only that it occupied more space in his chest than he was comfortable with, that he found himself constructing reasons to walk past Ember's windows, that he'd started to dread the day Sawyer inevitably got bored of small-town life and left for some bigger, brighter kitchen in some bigger, brighter city, the way ambitious people always eventually did. That fear, Elias realized much later, was the truest thing he felt. Not rivalry, not attraction, though that was there too, humming under everything like a live wire. Fear. The particular, familiar fear of loving something and then losing it. The fear that had lived in him since the morning 3 years ago when Marisol had called him, sobbing, to say their mother's heart had simply stopped in her sleep, and Elias had been 40 minutes away at a supplier meeting, and he had not been there. He had built Nana Roses into a fortress after that. Predictable, unchanging, safe. And here was Sawyer Reyes, unraveling all of it just by existing across the street, by leaving thank you notes under gravy lids, by looking at Elias like he was worth knowing. Terrified him more than he could say. He thought, some nights, of a particular memory from childhood. Standing on the dock with his mother the winter his father didn't come home, watching her scan the horizon for a boat that would never return. Her hand gripping his shoulder so hard it left marks. She had never remarried, never let herself want anything that large again, and Elias had absorbed that lesson so thoroughly he'd never questioned it. That the safest kind of love was the kind that couldn't be taken, because you never let it fully in to begin with. He had built his whole adult life on that quiet, unexamined creed, right up until a man in a ridiculous chef's coat had crossed the street with a bottle of wine and refused, ever since, to stay safely at a distance. The email arrived on a Monday in late November, and Sawyer read it 4 times before he told anyone about it. Sitting alone in Ember's small back office after close, the subject line glowing on his laptop screen like something radioactive. Culinary director position, Larkspur Hospitality Group, Manhattan flagship. It was, on paper, everything he'd once wanted. A flagship restaurant in the city he'd nearly destroyed himself in. Creative control over an entire menu, an entire brand, a salary that made Ember's careful, hand-to-mouth first year look like a rounding error. 2 years ago, he would have said yes before finishing the email. He didn't say yes. He also didn't say no. He closed the laptop, sat in the dark office for a long time, and told no one. Not his mother, not Diego, and crucially not Elias, because some old self-protective instinct told him that naming the offer out loud would make its pull more real than he wanted it to be. He told himself it was nothing. A formality. A no-brainer decline he'd get around to writing eventually. But he found himself, over the following 2 weeks, quieter at dinner, distracted during service, staring a beat too long at the framed photo behind Ember's bar of the Manhattan skyline he'd brought with him as a joke about the life he'd left behind. Elias noticed the distraction before Sawyer said a word about its cause. He noticed the way Sawyer's phone buzzed more often, face down, and how Sawyer angled his laptop screen away from the kitchen counter when Elias walked past. He noticed, too, how it made the old fear in his chest stir awake again. The fear that had never really left, only gone quiet for a while under the warmth of midnight coffee and a hand resting briefly over his. "You've been somewhere else lately," Elias said one evening, careful, testing the water, as they closed up Nana Roses together. A routine that had become its own quiet ritual, Sawyer waiting out the last of Ember's service, then wandering across the street to help stack chairs and wipe down counters, neither of them acknowledging aloud what the habit meant. "Just tired," Sawyer said, too quickly, not meeting his eyes. Elias let it go that night. He told himself it wasn't his place to push, that Sawyer was allowed his own private weather, his own thoughts he wasn't ready to share. But the unease sat with him anyway, a low hum under everything, familiar in the worst way. The exact shape of the fear he'd carried since October, that Sawyer's presence in Harbor Bend was a season, not a life, and that somewhere out there, something bigger was always going to call him back. He didn't know yet how right and how wrong that fear would turn out to be. The first week of December brought a nor'easter forecast that had the whole town boarding windows and stocking generators. Elias had lived through enough Maine winters to take it seriously. He spent 2 days reinforcing the Trattoria's old storm shutters, moving anything valuable off the floor in case of flooding, checking the wiring in the basement that he'd been meaning to replace for a year. He noticed, with a knot of unease he didn't examine too closely, that Ember's building, the old hardware store, hadn't been properly rewired since the 90s. He knew this because he'd overheard the contractor complaining about it in the hardware aisle of the new store 2 towns over, back when Sawyer was first renovating. Old wiring, old insulation, a fuse box that should have been condemned years ago. Sawyer had done what he could on a shoestring opening budget, but Elias suspected, with the particular clarity of a man who'd spent his life in this town, who knew every old building's secrets, that Ember was one bad storm away from real trouble. He almost said something. He got as far as crossing the street on the Tuesday before the storm, hand raised to knock on Ember's door, and then stopped, overtaken by a sudden, absurd shyness, the fear of seeming like he cared too much, of revealing something he wasn't ready to reveal. He turned around and walked back to the trattoria without knocking. It was a decision he would spend a long time regretting. The storm hit Thursday night, 2 days later than forecast, which meant the town had grown complacent, half convinced it would pass them by. It did not pass them by. It arrived just after 9 in the evening with wind that screamed off the water and rain that came down sideways, hard enough to sound like gravel against the windows. Elias had already closed the trattoria for the night, storm shutters bolted, generator humming quietly in the basement. He sat upstairs in the small apartment above the restaurant that he'd lived in since his mother died, watching the storm through a gap in the shutters, feeling the old building groan and shudder around him, thinking, as he always did during storms, of his father, lost at sea when Elias was 11, a fishing accident that had never fully made sense, that had taught Elias far too young how quickly the sea could take something and never give it back. It was 10:42 when he smelled smoke. At first he thought it was his own building, some fault in the wiring he'd missed, some old grease trap catching, and his heart lurched into his throat as he ran downstairs, checking the kitchen, the walk-in, the basement, finding nothing. Then he looked out the front window, through the gap in the shutters, and saw the orange glow flickering behind Ember's darkened windows across the street. For one frozen second, Elias Navarro did not move. Every instinct of self-preservation, every carefully built wall he'd spent 3 years constructing, screamed at him to stay inside, to let it be someone else's problem, to protect what was his and let the rest of the world burn. Then he thought of Sawyer, dimples, flour-dusted forearms, a full propane tank left wordlessly on his back step, a note that said better than the wine, and Elias was already moving before he finished the thought, grabbing his coat, throwing open the door into a wall of wind and rain, running across the flooded street toward the fire. The smoke was thicker than he expected, curling out from beneath Ember's front door in gray ribbons that turned black as he got closer. Through the window, Elias could see flames licking up the back wall near the kitchen. The old wiring, he thought with a sick lurch, exactly what he'd been afraid of, and beyond the smoke a shape moving, stumbling near the pass. The wind was trying to tear him off his feet, rain coming in horizontal sheets that soaked him through in the 10 seconds it took to cross the street, and above the storm's howl he could hear a low, structural groaning from inside Ember, the sound of old timber giving way to heat. Every window along Harbor Street was dark except for that terrible, flickering orange glow, and Elias had the sudden, dizzying sensation of being the only person alive in the world, running toward the one thing everyone else would have run from. He didn't think. He kicked the door, old, warped from years of neglect before Sawyer's renovation, giving way easier than he expected, and the smoke hit him like a wall, hot and acrid, stinging his eyes instantly to tears. Sawyer. His voice came out raw, swallowed by the storm and the crackle of fire. Sawyer. A cough answered him, low and near the ground, and Elias dropped to a crouch, remembering some half-forgotten fire safety lesson about smoke rising, and found Sawyer there, on his knees near the walk-in, one arm curled protectively around a young line cook. A teenager, 17 or 18, someone Elias vaguely recognized from around town, who was coughing violently, eyes streaming. Diego's ankle, Sawyer gasped out, voice wrecked from smoke. Twisted it, he can't. We need to get him out. I've got him. Elias didn't wait for an argument. He hauled the boy up, got an arm under his shoulders, felt the kid's weight sag into him, trusting, terrified. Sawyer, go now, the ceiling's about to. He didn't finish the sentence because a support beam near the kitchen chose that exact moment to groan and drop, showering sparks, and all three of them lurched for the door as one, Elias half carrying Diego, Sawyer's hand fisted in the back of Elias's coat like an anchor, like he needed to know Elias was still there, still real, still leading them out of the smoke and into the screaming wind of the storm outside. They collapsed together on the wet pavement of Harbor Street, all three of them coughing, soaked through, the rain hissing against the flames still visible through Ember's broken front window. Somewhere in the chaos, someone had called it in. A neighbor, a passerby, and Elias could hear sirens cutting through the storm, still minutes away, precious minutes that felt like hours. Diego. Sawyer was on his knees beside the boy immediately, hands hovering, checking him over with a kind of frantic tenderness that made something in Elias's chest crack open. Hey, look at me, you're okay, you're out, you're safe. Diego was crying, more from shock than pain, Elias thought, and Sawyer gathered him against his shoulder, murmuring something low and steady, the kind of voice you'd use to calm a spooked animal, and Elias watched him do it. Watched this man who'd seemed, for 4 months, like nothing but ambition and glossy magazine features, hold a terrified teenager like he was made of glass, and understood, with the force of a physical blow, that everything he'd told himself about Sawyer Reyes had been a story he needed to believe more than a truth he'd actually seen. Then Sawyer looked up at him, soot-streaked, soaked, eyes red from smoke, and said, voice cracking, "You came back for me." "Of course I did," Elias said, and it came out rougher than he meant, rougher with everything he hadn't let himself feel until this exact moment. Kneeling on wet pavement in the middle of a storm, watching his restaurant across the street through a gap in the rain, and Sawyer's burning. Sawyer's hand found his, soot-blackened, trembling, cold from the rain, and gripped it hard, and neither of them let go until the fire trucks arrived. Ember burned for 3 hours before the fire department got it fully contained. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a scrubbed, pale sky and a town gathered on the sidewalk in bathrobes and rain jackets, watching smoke rise from the gutted shell of the old hardware store. Diego's ankle turned out to be sprained, not broken. Sawyer had a mild concussion from a falling shelf and burns on his left forearm, minor but painful, wrapped in gauze by the time Elias found him again at 7 in the morning, sitting on the curb outside the wreckage, wrapped in a foil emergency blanket, staring at what was left of 4 months of his life. Elias sat down beside him without asking. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire department's hoses had left the street slick and black with ash-streaked water, and steam still rose faintly from the ruins, curling up into the cold morning air like something exhaling its last breath. "I gave up everything for this place," Sawyer said finally, voice hollow. "New York. My old life." "I thought," he laughed, short and humorless. "I thought if I built something small enough, quiet enough, it couldn't be taken from me. Guess I was wrong." "You didn't lose everything," Elias said. "You lost a building. It wasn't just a building." "I know." And Elias did know, knew it in the marrow of his bones, the particular grief of watching something you'd poured yourself into reduced to ash. "But you're still here. Diego's still here. That matters more." Sawyer turned to look at him then. Really look, something raw and unguarded in his expression that Elias had never seen there before. Not the confident restaurateur, not the rival, just a man, exhausted and frightened and grieving. "Why'd you come back for me, Elias? You could have stayed inside. You could have let the fire department handle it. Why'd you run into a burning building for someone you've spent 4 months hating?" Elias looked at his own hands, blackened with soot, cut in one place from the broken door. He thought about lying, about deflecting with something dismissive the way he'd deflected every real question for 3 years. Instead, for reasons he didn't fully understand, he told the truth. "I don't hate you," he said quietly. "I never hated you. I think I've been scared of you since the day you showed up with that stupid bottle of wine." "Scared of me?" Sawyer's eyebrows lifted, disbelief and something more fragile underneath it. "Scared of what you make me feel." Elias's voice cracked on the admission. 3 years of careful walls crumbling faster than he could shore them back up. "I built that trattoria into something that couldn't change, couldn't surprise me, couldn't leave. And then you showed up, and everything about you is changed, and surprised, and I kept waiting for you to get bored of this town and go back to the city. And I didn't want to," he stopped himself. "Didn't want to do what?" Sawyer's voice was very soft now. "Didn't want to care that much about someone who was always going to leave." The town was beginning to stir around them. A few early risers emerging onto porches in bathrobes, someone from the bakery 2 doors down bringing out a thermos of coffee and paper cups without a word, simply setting them down on the curb and retreating, the quiet, practical kindness of a place that had watched its share of hard mornings. Diego's mother arrived at a run, breathless, and gathered her son into her arms with a force that made Elias's throat tighten. Watching it, thinking of his own mother, of all the mornings he could no longer run to her. The steam kept rising from the ruins behind them. Somewhere down the street, a fire truck's engine idled low. Sawyer reached over, slow and deliberate, giving Elias every chance to pull away, and closed his soot-blackened hand around Elias's. I'm not going anywhere, Sawyer said. I burned my whole life down once already, moving from place to place, chasing the next thing. I came here to stop running. I meant it, Elias. Even now. Even with, he gestured, exhausted at the wreckage. All of this. Elias didn't answer with words. He turned his hand over, laced his fingers through Sawyer's, and held on. The way he should have held on that Tuesday morning outside Ember's door, when he'd almost knocked and hadn't. 2 weeks after the fire, Sawyer showed up at Nana Rose's back door just before closing, still smelling faintly of the insurance adjuster's cigarette smoke, exhausted in the particular way of someone who'd spent the whole day fighting bureaucracy instead of grief, which was, Elias suspected, exactly why he'd come. I can't go back to that empty room above the bakery tonight, Sawyer admitted, leaning against the doorframe, and think about claim numbers for 1 more hour. Can I just exist here for a while? Always, Elias said, and meant it more than he expected to. They ended up in the kitchen, the way they always seemed to, Elias making a late plate of leftover gnocchi neither of them really needed. Sawyer perched on the steel counter he had no business sitting on, watching Elias move through the small space with the easy, practiced grace of someone who'd cooked in it his whole life. You're good at this, Sawyer said. Not just the cooking, the steadiness of it. I watch you in here and it's like nothing bad could ever actually happen, because you just keep stirring the pot until it stopped. That's not steadiness, Elias said, plating the gnocchi, setting it down between them. That's denial with good knife skills. Sawyer laughed, and the sound of it, low and warm in the quiet kitchen, did something to the air between them that neither man commented on. They ate standing up, shoulders nearly touching, the kind of proximity that had become normal between them without either of them quite deciding to allow it. A hand brushing while reaching for the same fork, a shared look over some small kitchen disaster, the particular ease of 2 people who had, without discussing it, stopped keeping careful count of the space between their bodies. Diego asked me today, Sawyer said, licking sauce off his thumb, entirely unaware of what the gesture did to Elias's concentration. If you and I were together. I told him no. He didn't believe me. Smart kid. Is he wrong, though? Sawyer's voice had gone quieter, more careful, and when Elias looked up, he found Sawyer watching him with an expression stripped of its usual performance. Just open, and a little scared, and unmistakably hopeful. The kitchen felt suddenly very small. Elias set down his fork. I don't know, he admitted. I think about you more than I mean to. I think about that morning on the sidewalk more than I probably should. He exhaled, searching for words that had never come easily to him. I've spent 3 years making sure nothing in my life could surprise me. And you're the biggest surprise I've had since my mother died. And some days that terrifies me more than the fire did. Sawyer set down his own fork and stepped closer, close enough that Elias could see the small scar above his eyebrow, could smell rosemary and smoke and something warmer underneath both, and could feel the particular gravity of a moment about to tip irreversibly in one direction or another. Sawyer's hand came up, slow, giving Elias every chance to step back, and settled against his jaw, thumb brushing the corner of his mouth. I'm scared too, Sawyer murmured, close enough now that Elias could feel his breath. But I don't want to keep being scared separately, if there's a version where we're scared together instead. For one suspended, breathless second, Elias thought he might actually do it. Might close the last inch of distance and kiss him right there in the kitchen his mother had built, surrounded by the ghosts of every safe, careful choice he'd made since her death. And some part of him wanted it so badly his hands had already begun to rise toward Sawyer's waist. Then the back door buzzer went off, sharp and startling, Marisol's voice calling from the front. Eli, the walk-in's doing that thing again. Can you come look? And the moment shattered as suddenly as it had built. Both men stepping back at once, breathless, unsteady, the ordinary world rushing back in around them. I should go, Sawyer said, voice rough, not quite meeting Elias's eyes, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested the retreat cost him. Yeah, Elias agreed, equally unsteady. Probably. Neither of them moved for another few seconds. Then Sawyer squeezed his hand once, quick and warm, and slipped out into the cold night, and Elias stood alone in his kitchen for a long time afterward, heart pounding, wondering how close he'd just come to something he wasn't sure he was brave enough yet to want out loud. A question that would take the slow unraveling of the following month, and the sting of an unspoken job offer to finally answer. But grief and fear are patient things, and they do not release their grip simply because a hand has been held once on a burnt-out sidewalk at dawn. In the weeks that followed, Sawyer threw himself into insurance claims, contractor meetings, the exhausting bureaucracy of rebuilding a business from ash. He was staying in a rented room above the bakery 2 streets over, and Elias offered, awkwardly, the offer coming out stiffer than he meant it to, the empty second bedroom above Nana Rosa's, left over from when Marisol used to live there before she got her own place. Sawyer said no. Politely, gently, but no. I need to figure some things out on my own, he said, and Elias, still learning the shape of his own feelings, didn't push, though something in him ached at the refusal. What neither of them said out loud, not yet, was that the fire had cracked something open in both of them that was harder to face than the physical wreckage. For Sawyer, it had resurrected the old, familiar terror of being a burden. The hospital bed, the empty chair, Theo's voice saying I didn't sign up for this. He found himself, in the weeks after the fire, pulling inward, working himself ragged on rebuilding logistics, answering Elias's texts with shorter and shorter replies, telling himself he was protecting Elias from the mess of him, when really he was protecting himself from being left again. For Elias, the distance triggered its own old wound. He watched Sawyer grow quieter, more elusive, and some bruised 11-year-old part of him, the part that had lost a father to the sea and learned that love could vanish without warning. Decided this was simply confirmation of what he'd always feared, that Sawyer was already leaving, just slowly, just politely, the way people always eventually did. The Larkspur offer surfaced properly in the second week of December, and it did so in the worst possible way. Secondhand, through town gossip, rather than from Sawyer himself. Marisol heard it first from the mail carrier, who'd heard it from someone at the bank, who'd apparently processed paperwork related to a courier delivery of contracts to Ember's temporary office, the kind of small-town information relay that outpaced any newspaper. She told Elias reluctantly, watching his face carefully as she did. There's a rumor, she said, that Sawyer's been offered some big executive job in New York. Culinary director or something. People are saying he might take it. Elias felt something in his chest go cold and still, the particular stillness of a wound reopening exactly along its old scar line. He hasn't said anything to me. Maybe it's not true. Maybe he just didn't think I needed to know. The words came out bitter, sharper than Elias intended, but he couldn't quite pull them back. He found Sawyer that night at Ember, alone in the half-renovated dining room. Insurance paperwork spread across a folding table, exhaustion carved into every line of his face. Elias stood in the doorway for a long moment before he spoke, watching Sawyer's shoulders, the particular tension in them that Elias now recognized, in hindsight, as the tension of someone carrying a secret. Were you going to tell me, Elias said, or was I supposed to find out from the mail carrier? Sawyer's head came up, startled, guilt flooding his expression before he could mask it. Elias, Larkspur, Manhattan, culinary director. Elias's voice was tight, controlled in the way that meant he was working very hard not to let it shake. The whole town seems to know before I do. It's not, Sawyer stood, papers sliding off the table. Forgotten. It's not a done thing. I haven't accepted anything. But you're thinking about it. Silence. That silence, more than any words could have, told Elias everything he needed to know, and something in him, old, wounded, 11 years old and watching his father's boat fail to return to harbor, simply closed like a door. I knew this would happen, Elias said quietly, more to himself than to Sawyer. I knew it the first week you opened that place. I told myself not to get attached, and I did it anyway, and now what? Sawyer's voice cracked, something desperate underneath the exhaustion. Now I'm the villain for having an option? Elias, I built this place out of the wreckage of my old life. Do you have any idea what it does to me? Getting offered the exact thing I nearly killed myself chasing, right when I finally thought I didn't want it anymore. So why didn't you tell me? Because I was scared. The words came out louder than Sawyer meant, echoing in the half-finished dining room, and he pressed the heels of his hands briefly against his eyes before continuing, quieter. Because the second I said it out loud to you, it would become real, and I'd have to actually look at why some old, stupid part of me still wanted to say yes, even knowing everything I have here. Even knowing you. I didn't want you to see that part of me. I didn't want to be the guy who almost left again. Almost isn't the same as didn't, Elias said, and it came out flatter and colder than he meant it to. 3 years of careful self-protection reasserting itself all at once. A wall going back up brick by brick in real time. I need to go. Elias. But Elias was already walking out, back across the street, back into the trattoria, and this time he didn't look back at the lights across the way. He told himself it was self-preservation. He told himself he was simply getting ahead of the inevitable. He did not let himself examine, that night, how much it felt exactly like grief. By late December, they drifted into something that looked, from the outside, like careful friendliness. A nod across the street, a brief exchange at the fish market, nothing like the closeness of that dawn on the sidewalk. Marisol watched her brother grow more withdrawn with each passing week, and finally, on Christmas Eve, while they closed up the trattoria together, she'd had enough. You're doing it again, she said. Doing what? Building the wall back up. I watched you do it after Mom died. I'm not watching you do it to him. He's the one who pulled away first, Elias said, defensive. Did he? Marisol crossed her arms. Or did you both get scared at the exact same time and neither of you said anything about it? Elias didn't have an answer for that. He went home that night, to the empty apartment above the trattoria, and looked out the window at Ember's construction scaffolding across the street, dark and quiet, and felt, for the first time in weeks, the full weight of what he might be about to lose through nothing more than silence and fear. New Year's Eve fell on a Wednesday, cold and clear, the kind of Maine winter night where the stars come out sharp and close over the water. Nana Rosa's closed early. Elias gave the staff the night off, told Marisol to go celebrate with her friends, and found himself alone in the kitchen at 9 o'clock, doing nothing in particular, unwilling to go upstairs to the silence of his apartment. He didn't hear Sawyer come in until the back door creaked. He turned, startled, to find him standing there in a heavy coat, cheeks pink from cold, holding, absurdly, endearingly, a bottle of wine. I know, Sawyer said before Elias could speak. I know you don't drink imports here, but I figured New Year, new rules, and also I didn't know what else to bring. You could have just knocked on the front door. I didn't want an audience for this. Something in Elias's chest went very still. For what? Sawyer set the bottle down on the steel prep table, and for a moment he just stood there, looking at his hands, looking anywhere but at Elias, and when he finally spoke, his voice had none of its usual polish, none of the easy charisma Elias had watched him wield like a tool for 4 months. I turned down Larkspur, he said, 3 days ago. I should have told you the second I did it, but I've been sitting with it, trying to figure out how to say the rest of what I need to say. Elias went very still. You turned it down. I turned it down because somewhere in the middle of writing my decline email, I realized I wasn't even thinking about the job anymore. I was thinking about you, standing in this kitchen, telling me you're not going anywhere. And I realized I'd rather have this, the trattoria, the harbor, Diego stealing scraps off the pass, you, than any flagship in Manhattan. He shook his head, laughing at himself, a small, self-deprecating sound. I've spent my whole life thinking bigger meant better. Took nearly burning down my restaurant, and nearly losing you to understand that's not true. Why didn't you tell me the second you decided? Because I've been pulling away from you, Sawyer admitted. And I told myself it was because I needed space to rebuild Ember, and that's partly true, but it's not the real reason. He exhaled hard, like the words cost him something. The real reason is that the last time someone watched me completely fall apart, they left. Not gradually, not gently, they just left while I was still in a hospital bed, and told me I was too much. And after the fire, I was so scared that if I let you see how not okay I actually was, you'd realize the same thing. That I'm this whole, chaotic, burnt out, running from something mess dressed up in a nice chef's coat. And when the Larkspur offer came, some old, terrified part of me thought, maybe it's safer to leave first, before you realize that, and leave me instead. It felt safer to disappear a little at a time than to wait for you to leave first. Elias crossed the kitchen slowly, the space between them shrinking with each step, years of careful distance dissolving in the warm, quiet dark of the trattoria's kitchen. I did the same thing, he admitted. The second Marisol told me about the offer, before you'd even said a word to me, I decided you were already gone. I built the whole wall back up in about 10 minutes flat. Because it's easier for me to grieve something before it happens than to sit in the fear of maybe losing it. I've been doing that since I was 11 years old, watching for my father's boat that never came back. I didn't want you to see how much power that kind of fear still has over me. I'm not going anywhere, Sawyer said again, the same words from the sidewalk at dawn, but steadier now, more certain, weighted now with the proof of a decision already made. I know, Elias said. I think I've known since the fire. I just didn't know how to trust it yet. Do you now? Elias reached out and, for the first time, cupped Sawyer's face in both hands. Flour-dusted, work-worn hands, gentle despite everything they'd survived, and felt Sawyer lean into the touch like something starved for it. I'm trying, Elias said honestly. I've spent 3 years building a life that couldn't surprise me, because surprises are how you lose things. And then you walked in with a bottle of wine I didn't want. And you haven't stopped surprising me since, and I'm terrified, Sawyer. I won't pretend I'm not. But I'd rather be terrified with you than safe without you. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere outside, faint and distant, the town's midnight fireworks began. Muffled thuds against the cold night sky. The whole world tipping over into a new year. Elias. Sawyer's voice had dropped to something soft. Something unguarded. Can I kiss you? You'd better, Elias murmured, before I lose my nerve, and Sawyer laughed. A real laugh, warm and startled and delighted. Right before he closed the last inch of distance between them and kissed him. It was not a cinematic kiss, not at first. A little clumsy, both of them smiling too hard against each other's mouths. Sawyer's cold hands finding the collar of Elias's shirt. Elias's arms wrapping around him like he intended to never quite let go. But it deepened, slow and certain, into something that felt less like a beginning and more like an answer to a question 3 years in the asking. Outside, the fireworks kept going. And inside the warm, dark kitchen of Nana Rose's, 2 men who had spent months circling each other with rivalry and fear finally, quietly, chose each other instead. They didn't rush it. That was the thing Elias came to love most in the weeks that followed, that neither of them treated the New Year's Eve kiss as an ending to the story, the way movies sometimes did, but as a genuine beginning with all the slow, unglamorous work that implied. Sawyer moved into the empty room above the trattoria in mid-January, not out of romantic urgency but simple practicality. His rental above the bakery had a lease ending, and Elias's offer, made again, was accepted this time with none of the earlier hesitation. They learned each other in the ordinary hours. Elias learned that Sawyer hummed off-key while cooking, always the same 3 songs on rotation, and that he slept with one arm flung over his eyes like he was still bracing against 2 bright hospital lights. Sawyer learned that Elias kept his mother's recipe cards in a shoebox he touched every morning before service. A small ritual of grief turned into comfort, and that he still occasionally set out 2 coffee cups, though now, at least, there was someone to fill the second one. They fought, sometimes, about small things, about Elias's stubbornness, about Sawyer's tendency to overwork himself into exhaustion when the stress of rebuilding embers spiked. But they fought like people who trusted the relationship to survive it, which was, Elias came to realize, an entirely different thing than the silent, careful distance he'd mistaken for peace in every relationship before this one. Diego, healed and grateful, came back to work the line at Ember's temporary pop-up counter that Sawyer set up in a corner of Nana Rose's kitchen during construction. An arrangement that had seemed absurd to Elias when Sawyer first proposed it, 2 rival restaurants sharing one kitchen, and had turned, within weeks, into something the whole town started talking about with real affection. The rivals who share a kitchen now, the Harbor Bend Gazette called it, running a small feature with a photograph of both men laughing over a shared pot of gravy, an image that Marisol framed and hung behind the register without asking either of them first. By March, Ember's rebuild was nearly finished. Better wiring this time, reinforced beams, all the safety upgrades the insurance inspector had insisted on, and the whole town turned out for its reopening, packing both sides of Harbor Street, moving freely now between the trattoria and the bistro like the invisible wall between them had simply dissolved. Elias stood in the doorway of Nana Rose's that night, watching Sawyer greet guests across the street, dimples deep, sleeves rolled up, entirely himself in a way Elias hadn't seen since before the fire, and felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't felt since before his mother died. Not the absence of fear exactly, but something stronger than fear. a kind of quiet, hard-won faith that some things, once broken open, grow back sturdier at the seam. Sawyer's mother, Alma, flew out from Sacramento in early April, ostensibly to see the rebuilt Ember with her own eyes, though everyone involved understood the real purpose of the visit the moment she stepped off the puddle jumper at the regional airport and hugged Sawyer for a full 30 seconds before releasing him, studying his face like she was checking for damage. "You look happy," she said, sounding faintly suspicious of the fact, the way a mother does when her child has spent the better part of a decade looking anything but suspiciously happy. "It's a long story," Sawyer said, and glanced at Elias, waiting a few steps back with his hands jammed in his coat pockets, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been since he was a teenager meeting his first boyfriend's parents. Alma looked between them for exactly 2 seconds before her whole face softened into something warm and knowing. "Oh," she said, "it's that kind of long story." Dinner that night was at Nana Rose's. Marisol had insisted, had in fact threatened Sawyer with bodily harm if he tried to host Alma's first Harbor Bend meal anywhere but the Trattoria. And so the four of them crowded around the corner table where Elias and Sawyer had once shared midnight coffee over a flooded basement, plates of Sunday gravy and fresh bread between them, the whole scene lit gold by the past light. Elias, still, out of habit, left burning. Alma asked good questions, sharp, curious, unflinching, the questions of a woman who'd raised a son alone after his father left and had learned to read a room for hidden currents. She asked Elias about his mother, about Rosa, about the recipe cards Sawyer had mentioned over the phone with unmistakable tenderness in his voice. She asked about the fire, gently, watching both men's faces as they told the story together, finishing each other's sentences in the easy, overlapping way of people who'd told a story enough times together that it had become a shared possession rather than two separate memories. "He ran into a burning building for you," Alma said to Sawyer at one point, not quite a question. "He did. And you turned down Larkspur for him." "I turned it down for me," Sawyer corrected gently, reaching over to take Elias's hand on the table without a hint of self-consciousness. A gesture that would have been unthinkable to him a year earlier, in the guarded, ambition-hungry version of himself that had walked into Harbor Bend expecting to disappear quietly and instead had found the opposite. Had found, against every plan, a place to be fully seen. But he was a very good reason. Alma's eyes went bright, and she reached across the table to squeeze her son's other hand. And then, after a moment's hesitation, Elias's too, an inclusion that meant more to him than she likely understood. The small, ordinary miracle of being folded, without question, into someone else's family. Later, when Alma had gone up to bed in the guest room above the Trattoria and Marisol had headed home, Elias and Sawyer stood together at the harbor's edge in the cool dark, the string lights from the festival long since taken down for the season, only the boat's running lights and the stars for company. "She likes you," Sawyer said. "She's easy to like back." Elias looked out at the water, the same water that had taken his father, the same water he'd watched every morning for years with a kind of guarded, lonely devotion. Tonight it looked different. Not less dangerous, exactly. The sea never stopped being what it was, but less like something to fear alone. "I used to think loving this town, keeping the Trattoria exactly the same, was the only way to keep from losing anything else. I didn't understand that I was already losing things, every day, just by refusing to let anything new in. And now I think the bravest thing I've ever done wasn't running into that fire." Elias turned to look at him, taking in the familiar lines of Sawyer's face in the dark, the small burn scar still faintly visible on his forearm, a permanent, gentle reminder of the night that changed everything. "It was letting you stay after." Sawyer kissed him then, unhurried, salt air and harbor lights and 31 years of family history standing quiet witness behind them, and for the first time in longer than Elias could remember, the fear that had lived in his chest since he was 11 years old went, if not silent, then at least still enough to let something else, something steadier, something like hope, finally take up residence beside it. A year to the day after the fire, Elias found Sawyer standing outside Ember at dusk, looking up at the new sign. Sawyer had kept the same simple lettering, refused to let the fire change the restaurant's name or spirit, only its bones, with an expression Elias had learned to recognize as the particular, private grief that never fully leaves a person who's survived something. "Hey." Elias crossed the street, the same street he'd run across barefoot in a storm a year before, and slid an arm around Sawyer's waist. "You okay?" "Yeah. Sawyer leaned into him, easy now in a way that still sometimes made Elias's chest ache with how much he'd almost missed this. Just thinking about how differently tonight could have gone. If you hadn't come across the street. I was always going to come across the street, Elias said. I just didn't know it yet. Sawyer turned in his arms, searching his face with an expression equal parts fond and searching. The way he still sometimes looked at Elias like he couldn't quite believe his luck. Do you regret it? Any of it? The rivalry, the 4 months of being furious at each other, the fire. I regret the 4 months, Elias said honestly. I regret every day I spent glaring at you across the street instead of walking over and telling you the truth. But the rest of it. He shook his head, pressing a kiss to Sawyer's temple, feeling the warmth of him, alive and present and entirely his. The rest of it brought us here. I can't regret that. Diego jogged out of Ember's front door just then, waving them inside. The gravy's getting cold, and Marisol says if you two don't come eat, she's eating your portions. And Sawyer laughed, bright and unguarded, and pulled Elias by the hand toward the warm light spilling from the restaurant's windows. Inside, the two staffs had set up a joint dinner spanning both restaurants' finest dishes, laid out across a single long table that stretched, somehow, from Ember's dining room straight through the propped-open front door into Nana Rose's. A small, symbolic bridge the whole town had quietly built between two places that used to define themselves by their distance from each other. Elias sat down beside Sawyer, their shoulders touching, and looked around at the table full of people who had watched them become who they were now. Rivals turned lifelines. Two men who had once measured their worth by the space between their restaurants and now measured it by how little space remained between their hearts. To Harbor Bend, Marisol said, raising her glass, and everyone stubborn enough to fall in love in the middle of a feud. To second chances, Sawyer added, glancing at Elias. To not let fear win, Elias said quietly, meeting Sawyer's eyes across the candlelight, even when it's louder than everything else. Glasses clinked. Outside, the harbor lights blinked steady against the dark water. The same view Elias had watched every morning for years, except now, for the first time, it didn't feel like something to guard alone. Felt like something to share. The following October, the Harbor Bend Harvest Festival returned to the harborfront, and this time there was no rivalry to speak of. Only one joint stall, hand-painted sign reading Nana Rose's Ember, together run by two men who'd learned the hard way that the things worth building are rarely the things you build alone. Elias stirred the gravy. Sawyer plated the scallops. Diego, taller now, ran orders between them with the easy confidence of someone who'd once been pulled from a burning building by two men who would, within a year, build an entire life around each other. At the end of the night, as the crowds thinned and the string lights flickered on against the coming dark, Sawyer slid an arm around Elias's waist, chin resting on his shoulder, watching the harbor the way Elias always had, every morning alone, for years before this one. Best rivalry I ever lost, Sawyer murmured. Elias huffed a laugh, turning to press a kiss to his temple. Best fire I ever survived. They stayed like that for a long moment, the last stragglers of the festival packing up around them, Marisol and Diego's laughter carrying faintly from where they were folding up the joint stall's signage. A job neither of them seemed in any particular hurry to finish. Somewhere down the harbor road, someone had started a small bonfire on the beach, and its glow flickered warm against the early dark, sparks rising and scattering like something being let go, willingly on purpose. Can I tell you something, Elias said, that I've never told anyone? Sawyer turned in his arms. Always. For years after my mother died, I used to think this town was the only thing I had left to hold on to. That if I let anything else in, a person, a change, a risk, I'd somehow prove I didn't need her anymore, and that felt like a betrayal I couldn't survive. He looked out at the dark water, the fishing boats, the small bonfire glow. I don't feel that way anymore. I think she'd have liked you, actually. I think she'd have been glad someone finally made me put the gravy spoon down long enough to fall in love. Sawyer's eyes were bright in the low light, and he didn't say anything for a moment, just pulled Elias closer, forehead resting against his. For what it's worth, he said finally, I think my old life, the one I nearly burned myself out chasing. I think it was always just me looking for exactly this. A harbor, a kitchen worth staying in. Somebody who'd run into a fire for me and then stick around for every ordinary Tuesday afterward. He smiled, small and real. Took the long way to find it. But I got here. Across the water, the fishing boats came home for the night, running lights blinking steady through the dusk. Not a warning this time, not a memory of loss, but simply the ordinary, beautiful rhythm of a town settling in for another season, with two men standing at its center who had once been rivals, and had somehow, against every fear either of them carried, become each other's home. They walked back toward Harbor Street together, hand in hand, past the darkened windows of two restaurants that had once stood as monuments to everything separating them, and now simply stood, side by side, lit warm against the coming winter. Two kitchens, one town, one long, hard-won love story still being written, one ordinary evening at a time. A note before you go. Some of the deepest connections don't begin with sparks of romance. Sometimes they begin with rivalry, misunderstanding, even resentment, and it takes a genuine crisis to burn away everything except the truth of how two people actually feel about each other. Elias and Sawyer had to lose almost everything before they let themselves be truly seen, and maybe that's the quiet lesson underneath their story. That the walls we build to protect ourselves from loss are sometimes the very things keeping us from the people who'd never leave. If this story moved you, I'd love to know. Who did you find yourself rooting for first, Elias or Sawyer? And has there ever been a rival in your own life who turned out to be exactly the person you needed? If you enjoyed this journey through Harbor Bend, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more heartfelt LGBTQ love stories. New ones every week. Each one a little different. Each one, I hope, worth the time you spent with it. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next story.